Everyone. Hope everyone is enjoying their day. Today we are lucky enough to chat to Daniel. Daniel has written and published a fascinating story that we're going to hear about a little bit more over this interview. I wanted to try and dig into a little bit behind Daniel's process, how he actually got around to writing, editing, and publishing his book. Without further ado, I'll start with my first question, which is, Daniel, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, appreciate that, Brendan. I'm not sure if there anything really inspired me per se. I've been reading for quite a while from a young age. I've always liked detective stories, and I also like the ocean. I like boats and stuff. So at some point, um, I got pretty sick about 5 years ago, and I wasn't able to work. So I sat down and I just sort of started looking at sites that said how to write. I started writing a story with somebody, and it just kind of morphed into this over the course of about 4 years.
Okay, great. So you just came up with the idea, and then 4 short years later, had your book.
Yeah.
So I mean, in your reading or whatever, you didn't have a specific genre or topic that you thought would lead you into it. It just the story kind of coalesced as you were writing.
Well, the first book I ever read that was in this, or probably I had read most of the Hardy Boy books by the time I was probably 6 or 7 years old. I had read most of the Sherlock Holmes stories by the time I was in junior high school. But the Travis McGee books, the John D. McDonald books, the ones that have the color, the deep purple sky, the fearful yellow eye. Um, that was probably the strongest for a long time. And then Sue Grafton came along in the late 80s. I guess I was in high school at that point, and I was really impressed with her voice. And you will see between John D. McDonnell and Sue Grafton, you will see a lot of Leyland Chase. Or Leyland Chase is based a lot in their kind of what came out of that.
So in my youth, I also read a lot of Hardy Boys and a lot of Sherlock Holmes, but I must confess, Travis McGee and John D. MacDonald is not yet on my radar. I think I should add it in just to get a bit more of a well-rounded perspective.
Well, originally my character was supposed to be a lot more like Travis McGee, but that character is a little bit dated. Um, so I had to shift it a little bit more for the sensibilities of
Okay.
today.
Fair enough. Well, we live in a different world or a new world, so it's worthwhile keeping abreast of that or understanding about that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the terms plotter and pantser, but basically,
Mhm.
do you start with a clear outline of who your characters are, what your character arc is, and then fill in everything and then just write from there, or are you more of a flying by the seat of your pants kind of guy?
I think from the beginning, I just pants, and I think that that's important because I think you need to have that excitement, that energy. You have to dance like nobody's watching. You have to do that, I think, in the beginning. But at some point, and especially with mysteries, it becomes so complicated, you have to start writing things down. So I have the uh, index cards.
Okay.
Um, I have the charts. I'm doing one right now that's starting for another book, and I encourage people to develop their characters early. You don't need to write everything about your character, but I think you need to know who his favorite teacher was in the fourth grade. I think you need to know his first car. I think you need to know a lot about the character so that you can create reactions down the line. Um, and then I do kind of write about the first 20 or 30 pages, really just whatever. I'm often inspired by things that are in real life, and I really like dialogue. I think dialogue is extremely important. Otherwise, it sounds like a series of events.
Yeah. Uh, but writing dialogue is very challenging. I'm intrigued to go back to those two stacks of analog pieces of paper that you have there. Uh, no, I think it's very cool. I think it's a great visceral way of understanding what you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about your process? So I'm just intrigued to know, for example, you got the cards. Where do the cards get written individually? Do they get scratched out and edited? How do you organize that, and how does that correlate with the charts? I'm just in. It's always interesting to understand people's processes and how they write.
And that's an excellent question because I don't think any of this actually, like, if you took my stack of cards, you would not be able to write that book. If you took all of my charts, you would not be able to write that book because at some point you have to let that go. Then you have to start writing from the heart and you have to let the story, come from within. But I do think you need to have the organization. I do look at around 300 pages. So, that's about 75,000 to 80,000 words.
Yeah.
Otherwise, my very first drafts, I mean, they end up 150,000 words, and they could go even further. So I do have some limits on that, and I have a couple of coaches have said that if you put limits on it, you'll be a lot more creative, because then you do have to find the perfect word. You do have to narrow down your setting. You do have to focus. So one of the things that I found very helpful with my outlining is I know that there's going to be about 50 or 60 beats, and those are just, what I think of chapter headings. If you put a chapter heading and put the characters in it, I find it very helpful because I'm not really looking at the plot point per se. That's just one thing, but there's five characters in that scene, or there's five characters in that chapter, and I have to give them all fair time, and I have to get information out. So I start with the question, and we go, blah 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 blah, and then at the very end we have the wrap up, and hopefully everyone says, I wonder what they meant by that. And I gotta read, I've got to turn to the next page. And then I fool them and I don't have anything to do with that for a while. And then we come back to it in the, you know, middle of the book somewhere. So that's kind of the process of how I actually work. But I do spend a lot of time sitting looking at my computer, going and researching something. If I write about guns, I really want to know because I don't like people coming back and saying, well, that would never happen.
Yeah.
It's not to say it won't, and
So,
maybe
so,
that's a
so,
good
so, so
thing
let's
because
talk. Let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. How do you research? What kind of research do you do? Are you the kind of guy who watches YouTube videos? Do you are you a Wikipedia nut, or is it everything and anything?
I am a Wikipedia nut, and I do think that Wikipedia has a great sort of basic information on that. And Wikipedia can also gives me a lot of like good visual information. When I want to look at something place that I've never seen, I will go to either Maps or Wikipedia and get pictures out of that. I love Google Maps because not only can you see it geographically, but you can sit in the air over it and you can look at a town and you can set yourself up with that. I could write a story about wherever you are and come right down and put in relation the motels and the hotels and the restaurants and the pawn shops and so forth. um, but I agree that you can do too much, and you can get. I have had people comment on that. Do we really need to know that much about? I write a lot about what people are wearing. Do we really need to know that much about his shoes? Do we need to know that much about what her dress looked like? And I say sometimes yes, sometimes no.
What about my very bright shirt? Do we need to know enough about that today?
I would actually use that because it's poignant and it's something that helps. Like a lot of people don't remember who characters are because all they have is a name. But most of the time we remember people by kind of who they are.
Yeah.
Um, as opposed to, just what their name is right there, especially in books.
When I mean, we've talked about process a little bit. So we've talked about your your cue cards, your research process, but what about writing? How do you get to actually sitting down and doing it? If that makes sense. What's your day-to-day writing routine? What does that look like?
I try to I try to do something every day. I try to spend at least an hour getting something down, and sometimes it might just be a couple of beats and not even fleshed out. Sometimes it might be, and I always have like a working draft, the one make copies of the drafts over and over and over, keep putting numbers on them at the bottom, but I keep adding stuff to them until I've reached a point where I can read through it without stopping. If I can read through the 50 pages without saying, "Oh, I got to change that," then I feel pretty comfortable about that particular period. Um, and then I do have days. I find that my best writing comes when I have to do something later. When I have to go pick someone up, or I have to go to work, or I have to take the dog. I find that my best writing comes kind of under a deadline. And
Okay.
I don't know if people can do that, but I did have help with that. I had a lot of help with having deadlines in my alpha group. And I had a coach for a while who made sure that I had 20 to 40 pages for him every week. And that 40 pages went back to 5 pages.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Everyone knows when you have to do your homework on time, that urgency cracks the whip a little bit and gets you going.
Even if you're doing it in the parking lot. Yeah.
So you took 4 years, 4 or 5 years to write this, from initial idea to the end of the first draft, or to the to what sort of stage?
Believe it or not, the first couple of years, the first 3 years of this, I was doing other books. I was doing other stories. I have a story that's inside of me that right now that I'm playing with, and it's very close to me, and I haven't let a lot of people see it. It's the one that'll come at some point, but that was the one that I was actually working with early on. And then at one point they started asking for pages. And I said, okay, well, I've got to do something, but I'm not going to let them see my baby. So I created this character, Leland Chase, and he really was created from creating a book cover. And originally he was a musician who got kind of dragged into solving a murder in the building that he lived in. But I couldn't put that together, but I could sort of copy things that were in my mind already. And I got him into a position as that he lives on the coast with his estranged son, and he's a divorced dude who used to be a lawyer in a big city. And now he's come home and he's in his second career, and he kind of is sort of lazy about his job as a private investigator. Um, and he thinks that everything is kind of like not as serious as it really is. Like his first client ends up dead within 24 hours. So that's how we kind of got things started off with that. And it took me a little over a year with this. And in the last 6 months of it, like I said, I had people helping me. I had people encouraging to move along. And I did. I just wrote. And then when it came time to do my revisions, I started making my charts. I don't remember who it is that suggests that you go through all of the little steps, but I do have a chart with each chapter, so to speak. I use a 4-act play so that I can divide it in the middle neatly. First part is our hook. Our second part is the little, let's give some information. And then at the midpoint, I have the aha moment where, and it doesn't have to be precise, but I do have my detective say, okay, now I understand it. Now let's go after the bad guys.
You're talking a lot of theory here, and I think that's crucial in understanding it. How did you learn how to write? Because I mean, it's such a vast topic. There's creating characters. What does a scene look like? How does dialogue hang together? I mean, there's all of these different, I'm not going to say arcane, but difficult procedures and difficult things to learn. How do you go about doing that?
I'm not
Did you
sure.
go about doing that?
But I can tell you that when I was in school, I used to write minute mysteries in class. Much I didn't get a lot of learning done, but I wrote 2 pages of a minute mystery in class and shared it with my friends. Um, I I do encourage writers to read the simple stories. One of my favorite stories to read is Encyclopedia Brown. It's a early reader. It's designed for a fourth grader, but it really shows you how in like 11 pages to put a whole story together. Um, I like Holmes because the dialogue, even though it's stilted and it's ornate, there's a real snappy sort of back and forth with that. And if you're going to have a sidekick I really like what he did with that is that Holmes doesn't say much, but Watson explains everything that's going on with their detective for that. With Grafton, she uses Kinsey Mahone interiority a lot. We hear mostly her voice inside her head and her experiences to flesh out that character. Her plots can be complicated, but the motive behind solving them are pretty straightforward. This is a woman who she has to do this because she has no one else, and this is her, only source of income. So she has to succeed. And so she gets down to this really tight little survival thing. But I do encourage people to read Pinterest. That's how I found Now Novel. I think it popped up on one of my Pinterest feeds.
Okay.
But I think that you can find a kernel of goodness in almost anything you look at.
You've raised Now Novel, and obviously it's a subject close to our heart. How did Now Novel help you in this process?
I think it's an excellent place to get something done because you need to contribute to the group. You need to have pages available. And also, I think when we look at other people's work and when we do a little bit of teaching ourselves, it helps our work. And I don't mean this in the sense of saying, oh, well, I would never do that, or that's not the way, it should be done. But it's a way of saying, now this is an interesting way of moving somebody from point A to point B, which is something I have a lot of trouble with because I can spend a lot of time on what I call the road trip. And that is really not good in a book that you have to keep under 300 pages. But I enjoyed the way that we were able to engage. And then we had the tutors. We had guys like you and Jordan come in and say, well, this is excellent, but here's what your editor is going to say. This is excellent, but this is what you know, your readership is going to see.
If you look at the book that you've written at the moment, what was the most challenging part of the process that you found?
Bringing, I think it's bringing the resolution to a timely conclusion without feeling rushed or contrived. And I had a pretty long process in doing that. Um, I had I was afraid that it was going to come off as basically hokey in the end. Either that, or people were going to go, "Oh, I didn't know that it was about that." If I had known that it was about that, I would never have picked this book up. But I think that I seamed it together nicely. It's like, have you ever seen a sports jacket made? Seen it how tailoring works?
Yes,
They
yeah, yeah.
cut all the pieces apart. They cut all the pieces, and they got all those little chalk lines, and things get basted together, and they get. It doesn't look like a jacket at all, but when it gets finished, they put the buttons on it. Yes, and maybe that's kind of a good analogy for writing at least a mystery, is that you end up with a piece of cloth, and and your inspiration is, here's a piece of cloth. It was on sale. Do something with it. So now you got to work with the color, the fabric, the pattern, and
Yeah.
then you start cutting it apart.
So would you say that's also the most satisfying part, or is that too neat? Uh, is it always tying up the jacket at the end and putting the buttons on and looking at yourself in the mirror, if I may beat a bad metaphor.
Well, well, since I'm making this suit for someone else, the best part is when somebody slips into the suit and says, "Oh my, that feels good. That looks nice.
Yeah.
This is a good looking suit on me."
Yeah.
I guess maybe that's the the best part of it is
Yeah.
when somebody says, yeah, that was a pretty satisfying read. I might not agree with everything, I might have done it differently, but yeah,
Yeah.
I want to read
Makes
another one of
sense.
his books.
What do you wish you'd known earlier about self-publishing? If you had one sort of golden rule to pass on to people, what would that be? Or got a nugget of wisdom?
Going back to clothes, I wish I had known about thrift shops earlier.
Yeah.
I wish I had known about self-publishing in that it's easier than you might think, and it's a lot more satisfying. I think that I think if you're a writer, you have to write, but at the same time, if you want to be an author, you have to have a book. Um, I know that that sounds probably kind of strange, but yes, you can be a writer without a book. But I think if you want to be an author, I think you need a book. I think you need to have a physical book somewhere. And that physical book may exist on a Kindle pad, but there has to be something out there. There has to be someone more than you, your writing buddies, your mom, your
Yeah.
brother, there has to be people that don't know you reading your stuff. And I think that's the best way to do it. I also think it's a really good way to start polishing length. When I started writing, typical lengths for books were 90,000 words. Now, they're like 75,000 words.
Yeah.
People want to be able to read a book in about a week. And most people read about an hour a day, if that. So, you're talking about 75,000 words for people. So you have that limiter. And I'm not talking about books that are epic. I'm not talking about
Yeah.
series that go on for pages. And I'm talking about what I'm doing. And I've spoken to agents and they are actually looking, and they will. This will continue. I think this will continue to grow. They're looking at people who self-publish, and they're looking at people who have 5 or 6 books on their list, and they're looking and seeing how those books are progressing, because agents need someone who can produce, and they need someone who learns, and they need someone who can who knows a little bit about the business already, going straight in. Gone are the days when somebody gets a manuscript anonymously in the mail and says, "Oh my gosh, this is
This is
I've got to have that." Yeah.
so. Last question for you: what's next? What's coming up?
Well, the next book is Reckless. It is about a young man who, about 10 years ago, takes the fall for his father in a deadly car accident. And Leland is charged by his retained client to go pick him up he's being released from prison, to go pick him up. And sort of offhandedly, this young man makes a comment, and Leland finds himself invested. Um,
Okay.
so it is on the skids. I just need to hit it with a bottle of champagne, uh, knock it into the water. So but I'm having a little bit of trouble kind of grinding that resolution into a nice, neat, satisfying, um, ending right now. I have it all together, but it keeps coming out a little bit like contrived, I think is the word. Um, and I'm dealing also with 2 issues for my main character, is that he's going to make some pretty strong decisions about the people around him, and he's going to realize that even though he's 51 years old, he is still kind of naive.
Okay. Well, it sounds fascinating. Please let us know when it comes out. We'll add the link to this
Indeed.
post and below, and share it with our readers.
Well,
And
thank you.
thanks very much for your time today, and good luck with the next one.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. We'll see you all.